The path to Margaret's house wound through a carefully maintained garden, illuminated only by the faint glow of security lights. Claire's footsteps crunched on gravel as she approached the stone cottage that sat in the shadow of her own larger home. Despite the short distance, it felt as though she was crossing into another world, one where secrets had been kept for decades. Margaret opened the door before Claire could knock, as if she'd been watching from the window. Her silver hair was pulled back severely, and she wore a cardigan despite the warmth of the evening. "You came alone. Good," she said, ushering Claire inside. "We don't have much time." The interior of Margaret's home was a stark contrast to the Murphys' modern renovations. Antique furniture, faded wallpaper, and shelves lined with leather-bound books created an atmosphere of preserved history rather than contemporary luxury. Margaret led Claire into a small study where a fire crackled in the grate, despite the season. The walls were covered with photographs. Newcastle through the decades, Claire realized, a visual history of the town and its prominent families. "Sit," Margaret instructed, pouring 2 glasses of amber liquid from a crystal decanter. "You'll need this for what I'm about to tell you." Claire accepted the drink but remained standing. "You said someone saw me at Blackwater House." "Who?" "Someone who reports to me," Margaret answered cryptically. "I have eyes and ears throughout Newcastle. It's how I've survived all these years." "Survived what?" Claire asked, her patience wearing thin with the older woman's dramatics. Margaret took a seat in a high-backed chair, studying Claire with those piercing eyes. "Did your husband tell you who I am? What I was to his family?" "His father's secretary, for 20 years. A bitter smile crossed Margaret's face. "Secretary, such a sanitized term for what I actually did." She took a sip of her drink. "I managed Daniel Murphy's affairs, all of them, including those that never appeared in any official ledger." "The paramilitary connections," Claire said. "The money laundering." Margaret's eyebrows rose slightly. "You've been busy." "Yes, those activities, among others, but my role was more intimate than mere bookkeeping." Claire slowly lowered herself into a chair as realization dawned. "You and Daniel Murphy were involved." "For 18 years, Margaret confirmed without a hint of shame. Helena, Sean's mother, knew and tolerated it. She had her own diversions, mostly in London where she claimed to be shopping. Margaret's expression hardened. "But that's not why I called you here. I need to know exactly what you found at Blackwater House today." Claire hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "Just empty rooms, signs of hasty departure, nothing specific." "And who did you speak with?" "No one," Claire lied, watching Margaret's reaction. The older woman's eyes narrowed. "Don't play games with me, Claire. My source saw you speaking with James Callahan. What did he tell you about Eliza?" Claire's heart raced. If Margaret knew about James, what else did she know? "He said he doesn't believe Eliza went to America, that she disappeared the same day Sean left Newcastle." Margaret nodded slowly. "James always was too perceptive for his own good." "What else?" "That Richard Callahan discovered Daniel Murphy was laundering money for paramilitaries. That there was a confrontation, then a break-in at Blackwater House." Margaret stood abruptly, moving to a desk in the corner. From a drawer, she withdrew a manila envelope. "James doesn't know everything. No one does, except me." She handed the envelope to Claire. "Richard Callahan wasn't just threatening to expose Daniel's financial crimes, he discovered something far worse, something that would have destroyed both families." Claire opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside was a single photograph, yellowed with age, showing 2 men in 1920s attire standing together, smiling broadly. They were arm in arm, clearly close. "Thomas Callahan and Philip Murphy," Margaret explained. "Eliza's great-grandfather and Sean's great-grandfather. The patriarchs whose feud supposedly began the bad blood between the families." "They look friendly," Claire observed, confused by the image that contradicted the story of animosity and murder. "They were more than friendly," Margaret said pointedly. "They were lovers." Claire stared at the photograph, trying to process this revelation. Lovers? But Sean said his grandfather murdered Thomas Callahan. "That's the story both families have maintained for a century," Margaret confirmed. "The truth is more complicated, and was about to be exposed 15 years ago when Eliza disappeared." Margaret retrieved a wooden box from a bookshelf and set it on the table between them. Thomas Callahan was murdered in 1921, that much is true. But not by Philip Murphy. They were business partners, yes, but also secretly involved for years, despite both being married with children. When the political situation deteriorated, Thomas wanted to flee Ireland together. Philip, unwilling to abandon his family, refused. So what happened? Claire pressed. Thomas was killed by his own brother-in-law, who had discovered the relationship. To protect both families from scandal, Philip agreed to be painted as the villain, a business partner who betrayed Thomas for financial gain. Margaret opened the box, revealing stacks of letters tied with faded ribbon. Their correspondence, hidden for decades at Blackwater House, then discovered by Eliza shortly before she disappeared. Claire's mind raced. This is the evidence she mentioned in her letter. The proof of what truly happened all those years ago. Margaret nodded. Eliza found these letters hidden in a compartment beneath the library floor. She told Sean about them, thinking it would heal the rift between their families, revealed that the entire feud was based on a lie. Did Sean know what the letters contained? He knew. But Daniel also discovered Eliza had found them, and he was desperate to keep the truth buried. The Murphy family's standing in Northern Ireland business circles was built on the narrative of ruthless ambition, not on having a founding patriarch who was secretly homosexual in 1920s Ireland. Claire tried to fit these revelations into what she already knew. So the break-in at Blackwater House. Was Daniel searching for these letters? Margaret confirmed. But Eliza had already moved them. She'd given them to me for safekeeping, believing I was merely Daniel's trusted secretary, unaware of my more complex relationship with him. Why would she give them to you? Claire asked, suspicion rising. Margaret's expression softened momentarily. I had been kind to her. When she and Sean began seeing each other, I encouraged them, despite the supposed family feud. I wanted Sean to be happy, and Eliza was a lovely young woman. Did Daniel find the letters? Not then, but he knew they existed, and was determined to recover them, Margaret said, her voice dropping. And he was willing to go to extreme lengths to ensure they remained hidden. Claire felt cold dread spreading through her. What did he do, Margaret? The night Eliza and Sean arranged to meet by the willow tree, Daniel intercepted them both. He told Sean that Eliza had left for America with her parents, and he told Eliza. Margaret paused, swallowing hard. He told Eliza that Sean had betrayed her, revealed their plans to her father, ensuring the Callahans would leave immediately. But that's not what happened to Eliza, Claire said, certain now. She never went to America, did she? Margaret's eyes locked with Claire's. No, she never left Newcastle. What happened to her, Margaret? Claire asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Margaret rose and moved to the window, gazing out toward Blackwater House, invisible now in the darkness. I don't know exactly. Daniel never told me everything, but I know he went to meet Eliza that night, pretending to be delivering a message from Sean. Claire's heart pounded. Did he kill her? I don't believe that was his intention, Margaret said after a long pause. Daniel was many things. Ruthless, ambitious, occasionally violent, but not a cold-blooded murderer. I think he meant to frighten her, to ensure she left Newcastle without the letters. But something went wrong, Claire concluded. Margaret nodded grimly. The next morning he came to my house, soaking wet, agitated. He said there had been an accident, that he needed my help to clean up a mess. I assumed he meant destroying documents related to the paramilitary funding, which we'd done before. Claire felt sick as the implications became clear. But he wasn't talking about documents. No, he needed my help accessing Blackwater House after the Callahans had departed. We went that night, through a servant's entrance. He made me wait in the kitchen while he went to the cellar alone. When he returned, he was carrying a shovel, his shoes covered in fresh dirt. Oh my God, Claire whispered, her hands shaking so badly she had to set down her untouched drink. He buried her beneath the house. Not beneath the house, Margaret corrected, her voice strangely detached. In the abandoned ice house at the far edge of the property, near the woods. A small stone structure where blocks of ice were once stored in the days before refrigeration. No one would have reason to look there. Did you help him? Claire asked, horror mixing with mounting anger. Not with that part. But I helped him afterward. creating the correspondence supposedly from Eliza in America, intercepting Sean's letters to her, maintaining the fiction that she had simply moved away. Guilt flashed across Margaret's features. I told myself I was protecting Sean from knowing what his father had done. Claire stood, needing to move, to process this horrific revelation. And Richard Callahan? Eliza's parents? Did they know? Richard suspected something, Margaret admitted. He called Daniel repeatedly in the weeks after they relocated to Boston, demanding to speak with Eliza. Daniel convinced him she was staying with friends in Dublin, avoiding both families. Eventually, I believe Richard realized the truth, or enough of it to know his daughter was never coming to America. So he covered it up? His own daughter's murder? Claire couldn't comprehend such callousness. Think about it from his perspective, Margaret said coldly. If Eliza was indeed dead, revealing it would expose the letters she'd found. Letters that would destroy the Callahan family's reputation as much as the Murphys'. Better to maintain the fiction that she was alive but estranged from her Uncle James, who would ask too many questions. Claire struggled to assimilate these revelations, her mind whirling with the calculated deception spanning 15 years and multiple continents. And Sean? Did he know what his father had done? Margaret's expression hardened. That, Mrs. Murphy, is what you need to discover. Because Sean returned to Newcastle for a reason, and I don't believe it was simply to build a charming life with his new wife. Claire paced the small room, pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. That's why you warned me at the party. You knew I'd start uncovering these secrets eventually. I hoped you wouldn't, Margaret admitted. I hoped Sean had truly moved on, that the past could remain buried. But then I saw where you'd bought a house, with a direct view of Blackwater, and I watched Sean during the party, the way he kept looking toward the old estate when he thought no one was watching. You think he knows Eliza is buried there, Claire realized. That's why he wanted this house specifically, to keep watch over her grave. Margaret lifted her shoulders in a slight shrug. Or to ensure no one else discovers it. The question you need to ask yourself, Claire, is whether Sean is here to expose what happened or to continue the cover-up his father began. Claire remembered Sean's words earlier that evening. That's why I came back, Claire, not just to face my past, but to find out what really happened to Eliza. Had that been truth or manipulation? Why are you telling me all this now? Claire asked suddenly, suspicion flaring. You've kept these secrets for 15 years. Why reveal them to me? Because Daniel Murphy died 3 months ago in Spain, Margaret said, her voice flat. Heart attack while swimming. With him gone, I have no more reason to protect the fiction he created. Claire absorbed this new information. Sean never mentioned his father had died. No, I don't imagine he would have, Margaret said. Just as he never mentioned returning to Newcastle the day after the funeral, visiting Blackwater House alone at night. Claire's breath caught. He was here? Before we bought the house? I saw him myself, walking the grounds with a flashlight. Margaret leaned forward, her expression grave. Whatever Sean is looking for, whether it's redemption or something darker, he's involved you in a dangerous game, Claire. People who ask questions about Eliza Callahan have a habit of being silenced. Are you threatening me? Claire asked, suddenly alert to the potential danger of her situation. Warning you, Margaret corrected. I'm not your enemy. If I wanted to silence you, I wouldn't be sharing these truths. Claire moved toward the door, needing distance from these revelations. Time to think. I should go. Sean will be wondering where I am. Margaret nodded but caught Claire's arm as she passed. There's something else you should know. The land where Blackwater House stands, including the ice house, is scheduled for redevelopment. The county approved the plans last week. Construction begins next month. Redevelopment? But the house has been abandoned for years. Who owns it now? The property reverted to the county after taxes went unpaid for a decade. They've sold it to a developer specializing in luxury hotels. Margaret's grip tightened. When they start excavation, they'll find what Daniel buried. The question is what Sean will do to prevent that from happening. A chill ran through Claire. You think Sean would? I think desperate people do desperate things, Margaret said grimly. Daniel Murphy taught his son well. Family reputation above all else. Just be careful who you trust, Claire. Even those closest to us can become strangers when their secrets are threatened. The walk back to her house seemed longer than before, each step weighted with the terrible knowledge Margaret had shared. Claire's mind spun with questions, with doubts about the man she'd married. Could Sean be capable of continuing his father's deception? Of taking more drastic action to prevent Eliza's remains from being discovered? The Sean she knew, compassionate, ethical, dedicated to healing, seemed utterly at odds with such dark possibilities. But then, the Sean she knew had hidden fundamental truths about his past, had returned to Newcastle for reasons he'd concealed from her, had potentially bought their home specifically for its view of Blackwater House and the secrets buried on its grounds. The lights of their house glowed warmly ahead, a beacon of normality that now felt like an illusion. As Claire approached, she saw Sean's silhouette pacing in the living room, phone pressed to his ear. He was agitated, gesturing as he spoke. Rather than entering immediately, Claire circled to the side of the house where she could observe without being seen. Through the window, she watched her husband, trying to read his expression, his body language. Was this the man she'd fallen in love with in Dublin? Or a stranger wearing his face? Sean ended his call abruptly, tossing the phone onto the sofa with unusual carelessness. He ran both hands through his hair, a gesture of frustration Claire recognized, then moved to the liquor cabinet, pouring himself a generous measure of whiskey. As he turned toward the window, Claire instinctively stepped back into the shadows. His expression stopped her cold, not worry for her safety during her prolonged absence, but something harder. Calculation. Determination. The face of a man making difficult decisions. Claire waited until Sean moved away from the window before continuing to the front door. She needed to present a calm exterior, to conceal what she'd learned while assessing his reactions. The game of secrets that had begun with his family decades ago now continued between husband and wife. Taking a deep breath, Claire entered the house. Sean rushed to the foyer as Claire closed the door behind her. "Thank God," he said, enfolding her in a tight embrace. "I was about to come looking for you. What did Margaret say? You were gone for over an hour." Claire returned his embrace, hyper-aware of every nuance in his voice and touch. Was his concern genuine or performance? "She had a lot to tell me," Claire said, pulling away to study his face. "About your father and Eliza." Something flickered in Sean's eyes, wariness perhaps or calculation. "Margaret Byrne has her own agenda, Claire. She was more than just my father's secretary." "I know," she admitted to their affair. Claire moved past him into the living room, noting the whiskey glass, the discarded phone. "She also told me your father died 3 months ago. Something you never mentioned." Sean followed her, his posture tense. "It didn't seem relevant. We weren't close, especially in recent years." "Yet you attended his funeral in Spain," Claire pressed, watching him carefully. "And then came to Newcastle the very next day. Alone, months before you suggested we move here together." Sean's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Who told you that? Does it matter? It's true, isn't it?" He exhaled slowly, visibly deciding how much to admit. "Yes, I came to Newcastle briefly after the funeral. I needed closure." "At Blackwater House? With a flashlight at night?" Sean's facade cracked slightly, surprise registering before he controlled his expression. "Margaret has been watching me for longer than I realized." "Why were you there, Sean?" Claire demanded, her voice steady despite her inner turmoil. "What were you looking for in the dark?" "The truth," he replied after a long pause. "The same thing I've been looking for since we moved here. I told you that earlier, Claire. I came back to Newcastle to discover what really happened to Eliza. Did you know she never went to America? That your father intercepted you both that night at the willow tree, telling each of you the other had abandoned your plans?" Sean sat heavily on the sofa, the weight of the past visibly pressing on him. "I suspected as much after I found some of my father's papers following his death. There were phone records showing calls to Richard Callahan in Boston, notes about payments to maintain Blackwater House in the family's absence. It didn't make sense unless he was hiding something," Claire finished. "Something buried on the property." Sean's head snapped up, his eyes locking with hers. "What exactly did Margaret tell you?" Claire made a swift decision, opting to withhold some of what she'd learned to test Sean's honesty. That your father met Eliza that night, pretending to deliver a message from you. That something went wrong, that she never left Newcastle. Did she tell you where? Sean couldn't complete the question, emotion finally breaking through his controlled exterior. No, Claire lied, watching him closely. She claimed not to know exactly what happened or where your father might have hidden evidence of it. Relief flashed across Sean's features, followed immediately by anguished realization. So you believe it too, that my father killed Eliza, and I've returned to the scene of his crime. I don't know what to believe anymore, Sean, Claire admitted, genuine pain bleeding into her voice. You've hidden so much from me. Your engagement to Eliza, your father's criminal activities, his death, your secret visit here. What am I supposed to think? Sean rose, moving toward her, hands extended in supplication. Think that I love you. That I brought you here because I wanted to face the past with you by my side, not hide from it anymore. But you did hide it, Claire countered, stepping back from his approach. You let me believe we were starting fresh in a place that held no ghosts for us. Instead, I find we're living in a house specifically chosen to overlook the estate where your former fiancé may be buried. It wasn't like that, Sean insisted. When my father died, I found those phone records, the notes about payments. I began to suspect the story he'd told me about Eliza leaving with her parents might be a lie. I came to Newcastle, yes, but not to cover anything up, to finally learn the truth. And did you? During your nighttime excursion to Blackwater? Sean's expression darkened. No. I searched the grounds, the house, looking for any sign of what might have happened. But after 15 years, there was little to find. So you decided to move us here permanently, Claire concluded, to continue your investigation. To make things right, Sean corrected. If my father did something terrible, and it increasingly seems he did, I need to know. Eliza deserves justice, even after all this time. Claire studied her husband, wanting desperately to believe him. The anguish in his eyes seemed genuine, the tension in his body reflecting real distress rather than calculated performance. There's something else you should know, she said finally. Blackwater House is scheduled for redevelopment. Construction begins next month. Excavation, foundation work. The blood drained from Sean's face. Who told you this? Margaret. She said the county sold the property to a hotel developer after years of unpaid taxes. Sean sank back onto the sofa, visibly shaken. If they start digging, they'll find what your father buried, Claire finished, deliberately using Margaret's phrasing to gauge Sean's reaction. If Eliza is there. Sean sat motionless for a moment, then abruptly stood and moved to the window overlooking the darkened silhouette of Blackwater House in the distance. The same position where Claire had observed him standing contemplatively many times since they'd moved in. I need to find her first, he said, his voice hardening with resolve. Before the developers, before anyone else. Why, Sean? Claire asked, the critical question finally surfacing. To ensure she receives proper burial and her family gets closure, or to continue hiding what your father did? Sean turned to face her, his expression more open than it had been all evening. To expose the truth, Claire. All of it. What happened to Eliza, yes, but also why. The real history between our families, not the fiction both sides maintain for a century. The letters, Claire said, testing whether he would be honest about them. Sean's surprise seemed genuine. You know about those too? The correspondence between Thomas Callahan and my great-grandfather? Margaret showed me one photograph of them together, Claire admitted. Said Eliza had discovered letters that revealed the true nature of their relationship. Not just their relationship, Sean explained, energy entering his voice now. Evidence that Thomas Callahan wasn't murdered by my great-grandfather, as both families claimed, but by his own brother-in-law who discovered their affair. The entire feud was built on a lie. The consistency with Margaret's account lent credibility to Sean's version, Claire realized. He wasn't trying to hide the letters or their contents. If you're truly seeking justice for Eliza, why not go to the police? Claire challenged. Tell them what you suspect about your father. Let them search the property properly. Sean's expression grew pained. With what evidence? The suspicions of a son whose father recently died? 15-year-old gossip about a young woman whose parents maintained she relocated to America? The police would need more to justify excavating private property. And now the developers will be digging anyway, Claire noted, potentially uncovering what the police wouldn't search for. Exactly, Sean agreed. Which means I have weeks, not months, to find the truth myself, to understand exactly what happened that night, and why. Claire felt the weight of decision pressing upon her. Trust her husband and help him in this morbid investigation? Or maintain her distance, watching his actions carefully while conducting her own inquiry? I need time to process all this, she said finally. It's too much, Sean. Finding out your father might have murdered your ex-fiancée, that you've brought me to oversee her makeshift grave, that decades of family history have been fabricated. Sean reached for her hand, a gesture both familiar and suddenly strange. Take whatever time you need. But please know that everything I've done since my father died has been to uncover the truth, not bury it deeper. Claire allowed the contact, searching his eyes for deception and finding only the emotional exhaustion she herself was feeling. I want to believe you. But trust has to be earned back, Sean. You've hidden too much for too long. I understand, he said softly, releasing her hand. Where does this leave us? Claire glanced toward the window, toward Blackwater House and its buried secrets. I don't know, but I do know Eliza deserves justice, whatever form that takes, and I won't be complicit in hiding the truth any longer. As if in response to her words, Claire's phone chimed with an incoming text. Margaret? Be careful going home. You're being watched. Claire looked up sharply, moving to the window. In the distance, at the edge of their property where the woods began, a pinpoint of light was visible, a flashlight, moving among the trees. Someone was indeed watching their house. Sean, she said quietly, showing him the text and pointing toward the light. It seems we're not the only ones interested in Blackwater's secrets. The flashlight beam disappeared as they watched, leaving only darkness beyond their illuminated garden. Sean reached for his own phone. I'm calling the police, he said, already dialing. Claire caught his wrist. Wait, what will you tell them? That someone is walking in the woods near our property. They'll think we're paranoid newcomers. Sean hesitated, then set the phone down. You're right, but I don't like the idea that someone's watching us. Margaret said people who ask questions about Eliza have a habit of being silenced, Claire said, a chill running through her. Do you think whoever's out there could be dangerous? I don't know, Sean admitted, moving to the security panel near the front door to arm it. But we should be careful. Lock all the windows and doors tonight. As they moved through the house, securing it, Claire felt the fragile sense of home she'd been building dissolve completely. Their beautiful house on Mourne Heights now felt exposed, vulnerable, a glass box perched on the hillside, visible to anyone with interest in their activities. They had just finished checking the ground floor when a sharp knock at the front door made them both freeze. Sean moved to the security panel, where a camera showed their unexpected visitor. It's James Callahan, he said, his voice tight. Claire looked at the screen, recognizing Eliza's uncle standing on their doorstep, his expression grave. We should talk to him. Now? It's nearly midnight, Sean protested, and after everything you've just learned, he deserves to know what happened to his niece, Claire interrupted. If Margaret's account is accurate, he's the only family member who genuinely wanted to find Eliza. Sean's struggle was visible on his face, the doctor trained to help others warring with the sun, protecting his family's darkest secret. Finally, he nodded. All right, but let me do the talking initially. We don't know exactly what he wants. He disarmed the security system and opened the door to find James Callahan looking even more weathered than he had that afternoon at Blackwater House. The older man's expression hardened when he saw Sean. Murphy? He acknowledged coldly. I was hoping to speak with your wife. Mr. Callahan, Claire said, stepping forward. Please come in. It's late for a social call. This isn't social, James replied, entering but remaining in the foyer, his posture rigid. I saw lights on and took a chance you'd still be awake. Something's happened that you need to know about. Sean closed the door, positioning himself slightly between James and Claire in a protective gesture that didn't escape her notice. What is it? Someone broke into Blackwater House tonight, James said, his gaze shifting between them. After you left, Claire. They ransacked the library and my office, the same rooms where I store Callahan family records. Did they take anything? Claire asked, remembering the letters Margaret had shown her. Hard to tell with the state of the place, James admitted. But they were clearly searching for something specific. Papers, I assume, given which rooms they focused on. Sean's expression remained carefully neutral. Have you reported it to the police? James gave a bitter laugh. The police haven't cared about Blackwater House for 15 years. Besides, what would I tell them? That someone broke into an already broken-into abandoned house where I technically trespass myself? You think the break-in is connected to my visit today? Claire said, not a question. I think, James said deliberately, that stirring up old questions about Eliza has consequences. First you visit asking about my niece's disappearance. Hours later, someone tears apart the rooms where family records are kept. That's not coincidence. We didn't break into Blackwater, Sean said, an edge entering his voice. I didn't say you did, James replied, his gaze shifting to Sean. Though it's interesting that your first response is to deny involvement. He turned back to Claire. I came to warn you. Whatever you're investigating about Eliza, whatever you're uncovering, someone else is watching. Someone who doesn't want certain truths revealed. Mr. Callahan, Claire said carefully, I believe I know what happened to your niece, and I think you deserve the truth, however painful. Sean tensed beside her. Claire. She silenced him with a look. No more secrets, Sean. No more lies. Isn't that what you promised less than an hour ago? James looked between them, confusion giving way to sharp interest. What do you know? Claire gestured toward the living room. Please, sit down. This isn't a conversation for standing in hallways. James followed them, taking a seat while refusing Sean's offer of a drink. His gaze was fixed on Claire, years of uncertainty visible in the lines of his face. Eliza never went to America, Claire began gently. The night she was supposed to meet Sean, the night before her parents left for Boston, she encountered Sean's father instead. Daniel Murphy intercepted them both, telling each that the other had abandoned their plans. James's weathered hands gripped the armrests of his chair. Richard claimed she was with them. All these years. He lied, Sean said quietly, shame evident in his voice. My father lied to him too, initially. But at some point, Richard must have realized or suspected the truth. And what is the truth? James demanded, his voice breaking slightly. What happened to my niece? Claire exchanged a glance with Sean before continuing. Based on what we've learned today, we believe Daniel Murphy met with Eliza that night, intending to frighten her into leaving without certain documents she'd discovered. Something went wrong during that confrontation. He killed her, James stated flatly, grief and fury mingling in his expression. That bastard murdered my niece. We don't know the exact circumstances, Claire admitted. But yes, we believe Eliza died that night, and that Daniel buried her somewhere on the Blackwater property. James's face crumpled momentarily before hardening into resolve. Where? Where did he bury her? We don't know for certain, Sean said, and Claire noted he wasn't lying. She hadn't shared Margaret's specific information about the ice house with him yet. James stood abruptly, pacing the room with agitated energy. 15 years, he muttered. 15 years of Richard's excuses about why Eliza couldn't come to the phone, why she missed family events, why she never contacted me directly. All lies. Did you ever confront your brother? Claire asked gently. Tell him you doubted Eliza was in America? Of course I did, James said bitterly. Richard threatened to cut me off completely if I kept questioning him, said I was disturbing Eliza's new life with my suspicions. He stopped pacing, turning to face them. He knew, all along, he knew what had happened to his daughter and did nothing. We think, Sean said carefully, that Richard was protecting family secrets as much as Daniel was. Eliza had discovered documents that would have damaged the reputation of both families, revealed that the century-old feud between Murphys and Callahans was built on lies. James stared at Sean, bewilderment replacing some of his anger. What lies? What documents? Letters, Claire explained. Correspondence between Thomas Callahan and Philip Murphy, showing they weren't enemies as the families claimed, but lovers. Thomas wasn't murdered by Philip for business advantage. He was killed by his brother-in-law, who discovered their relationship. James sank back into his chair, visibly stunned. That's impossible. Our family history was rewritten, Sean finished. Just as my family history was, both sides preferred the narrative of business betrayal over the truth of who these men really were. And Eliza discovered this, James said slowly, piecing it together. She found proof that would have exposed a century of lies from both families. We believe so, Claire confirmed. And when your brother discovered Daniel Murphy's criminal activities, he threatened exposure. Daniel broke into Blackwater looking for the letters Eliza had found, but she'd already moved them somewhere safe. So he killed her for some old family letters? James asked incredulously. Letters about men long dead? Sean shook his head. The letters weren't just about the past. They were evidence that both families had actively maintained a fiction for generations, a fiction that powerful men like my father and your brother used to justify their ongoing enmity, their business practices, their social positions. Understanding dawned in James's eyes. And now someone has broken into Blackwater again, searching for these same letters. It seems likely, Claire agreed. Though we don't know who. The timing with my visit today can't be coincidental. James stood again, his movements now deliberate rather than agitated. I need to find my niece. Give her proper burial. 15 years is too long for her to lie in unconsecrated ground. We want to help, Claire said, ignoring Sean's warning glance. But we need to be careful. Whoever broke into Blackwater tonight could be dangerous. There's something else you should know, Sean added reluctantly. The county has sold Blackwater House and grounds to a developer. Construction is scheduled to begin next month. James's expression shifted to alarm. They'll be excavating. If Eliza is buried on the property, they'll find her, Claire confirmed, which means we have very little time to discover the truth on our terms before it becomes a public scandal. James studied them both, calculation replacing grief momentarily. Why should I trust either of you? Sean is Daniel Murphy's son. For all I know, he's here to ensure Eliza's remains are never found, to protect his father's reputation even after death. Because I loved her, Sean said simply, emotion finally breaking through his controlled facade. Because not a day has passed in 15 years that I haven't thought of her, wondered what really happened. Because I deserve the truth as much as you do, Mr. Callahan. James held Sean's gaze for a long moment, then nodded once reluctantly. All right, we worked together to find Eliza and these letters. But understand this, once we know the full truth, I will ensure justice is served, no matter whose reputation is destroyed in the process. Agreed, Claire said, before Sean could respond. We start tomorrow, the three of us, searching Blackwater properly. As James turned to leave, he paused at the door. One last thing. After you left today, Claire, I called an old friend at the county records office. The sale of Blackwater to developers wasn't public knowledge yet. Only those directly involved knew about it. So how did you know? He asked, looking directly at Sean. Margaret Byrne told my wife, Sean replied. My father's former secretary. She seems to have maintained connections throughout Newcastle. James's expression darkened. Margaret Byrne is not to be trusted. She was more than your father's secretary. She was his accomplice in everything he did. If she's involving herself now, after all these years, she has reasons of her own. Be very careful. With that warning, James departed, leaving Claire and Sean standing in silence, the weight of decades of secrets pressing down on them. He's right about Margaret, Sean said finally. She's not telling us everything. Claire turned to her husband, decision crystallizing. Neither are you, Sean. There's still something you're holding back. I can feel it. Sean met her gaze, conflict visible in his eyes. There is something else, he admitted. Something I discovered in my father's papers after his death. Something I haven't fully processed myself. What is it? Claire asked, dread building. A DNA test, Sean said quietly. Conducted secretly 15 years ago. The results suggest Eliza was pregnant when she disappeared. Claire stared at her husband, the final piece of the puzzle clicking into place with sickening clarity. The child was yours. Sean nodded, anguish etching deeper lines in his face. If my father killed Eliza that night, he didn't just murder my fiancée, he murdered his own grandchild. Claire barely slept that night, her mind churning with each new revelation. The Sean she'd married, the man she thought she knew completely, had become increasingly unrecognizable over the past 24 hours. Not only had he hidden his previous engagement and his connection to Newcastle, but now she learned he'd potentially fathered a child with Eliza before her disappearance. When daylight finally began filtering through their bedroom windows, Claire slipped quietly from bed, leaving Sean still asleep. She needed space to think, to process everything without his presence influencing her judgment. In the kitchen, she made coffee and stood looking out toward Blackwater House. The morning mist hung low over the grounds, shrouding the mansion in an ethereal haze that softened its decay. Somewhere on that property, Eliza Callahan and her unborn child had lain hidden for 15 years. Claire's phone buzzed with a text from James Callahan. "Meet me at Blackwater at 8 a.m. I may have found something." Glancing at the clock, 7:15, Claire made a swift decision. She would go alone, speak with James before Sean joined them. She needed to hear the older man's perspective without her husband's influence. Leaving a note for Sean explaining she'd gone ahead to meet James, Claire drove the short distance to Blackwater House. The morning was quiet, few people stirring in the exclusive neighborhood at this early hour. She parked outside the rusting gates and made her way on foot up the overgrown drive. James's battered Land Rover was already parked near the front steps. As Claire approached the house, she heard movement from around the side of the building. Following the sounds, she found James emerging from a tangle of overgrown rhododendrons, his clothes damp from the dew-soaked foliage. "You came alone. Good," he said, echoing Margaret's words from the previous night. "I've been here since dawn. Something Margaret Byrne told you got me thinking." Claire tensed. "What do you mean?" "Sean mentioned she told you about the development plans," James explained. "But he also said you discussed where Eliza might be buried. Did she mention anything specific?" Claire hesitated, uncertain how much to reveal. "She suggested Daniel Murphy buried something in an outbuilding, not in the house itself." James's eyes sharpened. "Which outbuilding?" "She wasn't specific," Claire lied, unwilling to share details until she understood James's intentions better. He studied her for a moment, clearly sensing her evasion. "There are several possibilities: the old stables, the gardener's cottage, the greenhouse, and the ice house." At Claire's slight reaction to the last item, James nodded grimly. "That's what I thought. The ice house would be ideal. Remote, cool, with a stone floor that could be easily disturbed and replaced. Come with me." He led Claire along an overgrown path that wound away from the mansion, deeper into the estate grounds. After several minutes of walking, they emerged into a small clearing where a strange dome-like structure emerged from a hillock, half buried in the earth, with a single wooden door set into its exposed stone face. "Victorian estates often had these for storing ice harvested in winter," James explained, approaching the weathered door. "This one hasn't been used for its original purpose since the 1930s. When Eliza and I were close, she used to joke it would make a perfect hiding place for treasure." A chill ran through Claire that had nothing to do with the morning air. "Have you looked inside?" "Not yet," James admitted. "The door has a padlock, recent, not aged like the rest of the structure. Someone secured it deliberately within the past few years." Claire examined the lock, sturdy and modern, incongruous against the ancient wooden door. "We need bolt cutters." "Already have them," James said, retrieving a tool from a bag he'd left near the entrance. "I came prepared. The question is whether we should wait for Sean before proceeding." Claire thought of her husband, still sleeping in their bed, unknowing that she was about to potentially discover the remains of his former fiancé and unborn child. The Sean she'd known in Dublin would deserve to be present for such a moment. But the Sean who had hidden so much from her, who might still be concealing crucial information? "Let's open it," she decided. "If we find something, we can call him immediately." James nodded, positioning the bolt cutters around the padlock's shackle. With a single powerful squeeze, the lock broke open, falling to the ground with a heavy thud. The door creaked ominously as James pulled it open, revealing a dark chamber beyond. The air that escaped was stale, musty, untouched for years. James produced a powerful flashlight from his bag, illuminating rough stone walls and a dirt floor. "It's larger than I expected," Claire observed, taking a step inside. The chamber was perhaps 15 feet in diameter, with a domed ceiling rising to a central point. The floor appeared to be packed earth, though stone walls surrounded it. James played his light systematically around the space. Look for any sign of disturbance in the floor. Even after 15 years, there should be some indication if the soil was dug up and replaced. Claire moved slowly along the perimeter while James examined the center of the chamber. The stillness was oppressive, the weight of what they might discover pressing down on them both. "Here," James called suddenly, his voice tight. "The earth is different in this section. Looser, with different coloration." Claire joined him, kneeling to examine the area his light illuminated. A roughly rectangular section of the floor, approximately 6 feet long by 3 feet wide, showed subtle signs of disturbance. The soil less compacted than surrounding areas, the color slightly different. "It could be her," Claire whispered, the reality of what they might uncover suddenly overwhelming. James set his jaw determinedly. "We need to know for certain." From his bag, he produced a small folding shovel. "I'll dig. You can step outside if you prefer." "No," Claire said firmly. "I'll stay. If Eliza is here, she shouldn't be alone with strangers when she's finally found." James began carefully removing soil from the suspicious area. The earth yielded easily, suggesting it had been disturbed more recently than the surrounding compacted floor. They worked in silence, the only sound their breathing and the scrape of the shovel against dirt. About 2 feet down, the shovel struck something solid with a dull thud. James immediately stopped digging, brushing away loose soil with his hands to reveal weathered wood, the top of what appeared to be a crude coffin or crate. "My God," he breathed, his hands trembling slightly. He buried her in a box. Claire felt sick, imagining Daniel Murphy constructing this makeshift coffin, placing Eliza inside, burying her in this forgotten corner of the estate she'd loved. "Should we open it?" James hesitated, conflict evident on his face. "We should document everything properly. If this is indeed Eliza, this becomes a crime scene. We need to call the police. But once we do, everything becomes public," Claire pointed out. "The investigation, the family history, all of it." "That's as it should be," James said firmly. "Eliza deserves justice, not more secrets." Before Claire could respond, a voice spoke from the doorway behind them. "He's right, no more secrets." They turned to find Sean standing in the entrance, his face ashen in the dim light. "I got your note," he said to Claire. "Followed your car here." James stood, positioning himself protectively in front of the partial excavation. "This is Eliza, isn't it? Your father buried her here after killing her." Sean stepped into the ice house, his medical training evident in the clinical way he approached and examined the exposed wood. "It appears to be a burial site," he confirmed, his voice detached, professional. "But we won't know it's Eliza until proper forensic examination is conducted." "Who else would be buried in a box on your ex-fiancé's family estate?" James demanded angrily. "The same night she disappeared?" "I'm not denying the obvious conclusion," Sean said quietly. "But as a doctor, I know the importance of scientific confirmation, especially in a case like this." Claire watched her husband carefully, searching for signs of the grief, shock, or guilt such a discovery should provoke. Instead, she saw only that same clinical detachment, the doctor's mask he wore during difficult consultations. "I'm calling the police," James declared, pulling out his phone. "Wait," Sean said sharply. "Before you make that call, there's something you both need to see." He reached into his jacket and withdrew an envelope. "I found this last night after Claire went to bed. It was hidden in a false bottom of my father's old briefcase, which I brought back from Spain after his death." "What is it?" Claire asked, moving closer. "A letter from your brother," Sean said, handing the envelope to James. "Written to my father 2 weeks after the Callahans supposedly left for Boston." James took the envelope with obvious reluctance, opening it to reveal a single sheet of paper. As he read, his expression transformed from suspicion to shock to something approaching horror. "This can't be real," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "Richard would never." "What does it say?" Claire demanded, taking the letter from James's unresisting hand. The letter was brief, typed on Callahan family letterhead with Richard's signature at the bottom. "Daniel, the arrangements have been made as discussed. He will be listed as arriving with us in Boston on all official documentation. In return, I expect the documents she discovered to remain buried as deeply as she is. Neither family would survive their exposure. The account in Zurich has been created. Transfer the agreed amount by month's end. Should you fail to fulfill your obligation, or should E's disappearance ever be traced to you, be assured that I possess sufficient evidence of your paramilitary connections to destroy you completely, regardless of the cost to myself. This concludes our business. Do not attempt further contact. Richard Callahan. Claire looked up from the letter in disbelief. Richard knew Daniel had killed Eliza, and he helped cover it up in exchange for money and to keep the family letters hidden. My brother would never abandon his daughter, James insisted, though doubt had crept into his voice. He loved Eliza more than anything. Not more than the Callahan family reputation, apparently, Sean said grimly. And not more than the fortune my father paid him to maintain the fiction that Eliza was alive in America. James snatched the letter back, studying it more carefully. This could be forged. Your father could have created this to protect himself if the truth ever came out. It's possible, Sean acknowledged, but it would explain why Richard has maintained the story about Eliza being in America for 15 years, despite your doubts. It would explain why he's never allowed you to speak directly with her. Claire's mind raced with the implications. If this letter is genuine, both families were complicit in covering up Eliza's death. Both patriarchs placed reputation and money above justice for her. Which is why, Sean said firmly, we need to expose everything now. Call the police, James. Report what we found. Let proper authorities excavate this site, identify the remains, conduct a real investigation into who killed Eliza and why. James stared at Sean, suspicion warring with the weight of evidence before him. You do that? Risk your family name, your father's reputation? My father is dead, Sean replied, a hardness entering his voice, and whatever remains of the Murphy reputation isn't worth the continued concealment of what happened to Eliza. She deserves justice, and so does our child. At this, James's head snapped up. Child? What child? Claire watched the two men, the final pieces of this tragic puzzle falling into place. Eliza was pregnant when she disappeared, she explained gently. We believe the baby was Sean's. James's weathered face crumpled, the full horror of his niece's fate and that of her unborn child finally hitting home. All these years, he whispered. All these years, I suspected something was wrong, but never this. Never this. He fumbled with his phone, tears blurring his vision as he dialed emergency services. As he spoke with the dispatcher, explaining their discovery, Claire moved to stand beside Sean, near the partially excavated gravesite. You didn't tell me you found that letter, she said quietly. I wasn't sure what to think of it, Sean admitted. It seemed too convenient. Evidence that exonerated me while implicating both our fathers. I needed to see if independent investigation led to the same conclusion before sharing it. And now? Claire asked, studying her husband's face. Now that we've found what appears to be Eliza's grave, exactly where Margaret said she would be. Sean met her gaze directly. Now I believe my father killed Eliza, deliberately or accidentally. I believe Richard Callahan helped cover it up to protect family secrets and enrich himself. And I believe the truth needs to come out, regardless of the consequences to either family. Before Claire could respond, James rejoined them, his composure somewhat restored. Police are on their way. They're treating it as a potential homicide scene. He looked at the exposed wood of the makeshift coffin, grief etching deep lines in his face. Whatever happens next, I want you both to know, finding Eliza matters more to me than any family reputation or historical secret. She deserved better than this. Better than all of us. As the wail of sirens became audible in the distance, Claire thought of Margaret Byrne, whose revelations had led them to this moment. Had the older woman known about Richard Callahan's complicity? Was that part of what she'd meant when she warned that the truth would ruin everything Claire thought she knew about Mourne Heights? The first police car appeared at the end of the overgrown drive, lights flashing through the morning mist. Whatever secrets remained hidden in the tangled history of the Murphys and Callahans, they would soon be exposed to the harsh light of official investigation, along with whoever had truly been responsible for Eliza's death 15 years ago. The next 12 hours passed in a blur of police activity, formal statements, and crime scene technicians transforming the peaceful grounds of Blackwater House into a cordoned-off investigation zone. Claire, Sean, and James were separated for individual questioning, each recounting their version of events and how they had come to discover the burial site. By late afternoon, Claire sat alone in an interview room at the Newcastle police station, fatigue settling into her bones. She had told the detectives everything, almost everything. She'd omitted Margaret's specific mention of the ice house, explaining instead that they had examined various outbuildings based on James's knowledge of the property. The last thing she needed was to implicate Margaret Byrne directly before understanding the full extent of the woman's involvement. Detective Inspector Walsh, a stern woman in her 50s with shrewd eyes that reminded Claire uncomfortably of Margaret, entered the room with a folder of documents. "Mrs. Murphy," she said, taking the seat opposite Claire. "Thank you for your patience. We've completed preliminary examination of the burial site." Claire sat straighter. "Have you confirmed it's Eliza Callahan?" "We won't have DNA confirmation for some time," the inspector replied carefully. "But the remains appear to be female, approximately the right age and height. And yes, preliminary examination suggests the deceased was an early pregnancy at time of death." Though Claire had already suspected this, hearing official confirmation sent a wave of sadness through her. Not just Eliza, but her unborn child, Sean's child, buried so callously in that lonely place. "Cause of death?" she asked quietly. "Too early to determine conclusively," Walsh said. "There's evidence of blunt force trauma to the skull, but we can't yet say if that was the cause of death or occurred post-mortem. The forensic team will need time to complete their examination." Claire nodded, trying to process these clinical details about a woman who had become increasingly real to her over the past 2 days. "What happens now?" "We've opened a formal murder investigation," Walsh explained. "Given the evidence suggesting Daniel Murphy's involvement and the fact that he's deceased, we'll be focusing on whether others were complicit in either the killing or its concealment." "Richard Callahan," Claire supplied. "Eliza's father." "Among others," Walsh agreed. "We've already contacted authorities in Boston to locate and interview Mr. Callahan, and we'll be speaking with anyone who had connections to both families at the time of Miss Callahan's disappearance." "Like Margaret Byrne," Claire said, watching the inspector's reaction. A flicker of something, recognition perhaps or confirmation, crossed Walsh's features. "Miss Byrne has already made herself available for questioning. She provided a statement this afternoon." This surprised Claire. "She came to the station voluntarily?" "She did," Walsh confirmed. "She presented herself as having information relevant to our investigation." The inspector studied Claire carefully. "She mentioned you visited her last night, that she shared certain historical details about the Murphy and Callahan families." "That's correct," Claire acknowledged. "She told me she believed Daniel Murphy was responsible for Eliza's disappearance." "Did she mention specific knowledge of where the body was buried?" Claire hesitated, weighing her response. "She suggested it might be in an outbuilding rather than the main house. She didn't specify the ice house." Walsh made a note in her folder, her expression revealing nothing. "I see. And did she mention her own relationship with Daniel Murphy during this conversation?" "She acknowledged they had an affair spanning many years." "Nothing beyond that? No mention of her presence at Blackwater House around the time of Eliza's disappearance?" Claire's pulse quickened. "No, she implied she learned details after the fact from Daniel." Walsh nodded, making another note. "One last question, Mrs. Murphy. In your earlier statement, you mentioned finding letters in your attic, correspondence between Eliza and your husband. Do you still have these letters?" "Yes," Claire confirmed. "They're at our house. I can provide them to the investigation." "That would be helpful," Walsh said, closing her folder. "We'll also need the letter your husband found in his father's belongings, the one supposedly from Richard Callahan acknowledging awareness of his daughter's death." "Of course," Claire agreed, though I should mention Sean had doubts about its authenticity. It seemed too convenient, evidence implicating both fathers while potentially exonerating Sean himself. Walsh's expression sharpened with interest. "Your husband expressed these doubts to you?" "Yes," He said the letter seemed too convenient and he wanted independent confirmation before fully trusting it. Interesting, Walsh murmured. Most people would immediately accept evidence that clears them of suspicion. Claire felt a flare of defensiveness. Sean wants the truth about what happened to Eliza, regardless of where it leads. That's why we came back to Newcastle. Walsh studied Claire for a long moment. You believe in your husband's innocence, despite the significant deceptions he's maintained throughout your marriage? I believe Sean loved Eliza, Claire replied carefully. And I believe he's genuinely horrified by what appears to have happened to her. Whether he's been entirely truthful with me about everything, that remains to be seen. The inspector nodded, seemingly satisfied with this honest assessment. You're free to go home, Mrs. Murphy. We'll be in touch regarding those letters, and we may have additional questions as the investigation progresses. As Claire gathered her belongings, Walsh added, One more thing. We've released James Callahan, but your husband is still being interviewed. Given the nature of his connection to the victim and his father's apparent involvement, his statement is quite detailed. Claire understood the subtext. Sean was under more intensive questioning, perhaps even suspicion. Can I wait for him? That might be some time, Walsh advised. We can call you when he's released. Reluctantly, Claire agreed, leaving the police station alone as dusk settled over Newcastle. Outside, camera crews from regional news outlets had already gathered, alerted to the discovery of human remains at the prestigious Blackwater estate. She hurried to her car, avoiding eye contact with reporters calling questions about what had been found. The drive home felt surreal. Returning to their beautiful house while Eliza's remains were being scientifically examined, while Sean was still answering police questions about his connection to her death. How had her life transformed so completely in just 2 days? As Claire turned onto Sleve Donard Avenue, she noticed a familiar figure standing at the entrance to Margaret Burns' cottage. Margaret herself watching Claire's approach with that same calculating expression she'd worn during their first meeting. Claire made an impulsive decision, pulling into Margaret's drive rather than continuing to her own home. The older woman waited as Claire exited her car, neither welcoming nor surprised by the unannounced visit. You've had a long day with the police, Margaret observed coolly. As have I. You gave them a statement, Claire said, approaching, voluntarily. Of course, I've lived with these secrets for 15 years. It's time they were exposed properly. What exactly did you tell them? Claire asked, searching the older woman's face for clues. Margaret smiled thinly. The truth, dear. That Daniel Murphy killed Eliza Callahan, that Richard Callahan helped conceal it, and that I assisted in maintaining their fiction afterward. You admitted your own complicity? Claire couldn't hide her surprise. I'm 73 years old, Margaret said matter-of-factly. Whatever legal consequences I might face pale in comparison to the weight of secrets I've carried. Besides, I have terminal cancer, 6 months at most, according to my doctors. Prison holds little fear for me now. Claire absorbed this unexpected revelation. I'm sorry about your diagnosis. Don't be. It's provided clarity about what matters, about what truths should die with me, and which ones deserve to live on. Margaret gestured toward her door. Come inside. There are still things you need to know, things I haven't shared with the police. Why tell me instead of them? Claire asked, suspicious of the older woman's motives. Margaret's expression softened slightly. Because you're caught in the middle of a tragedy you didn't create, because you deserve to understand exactly what kind of man you married. The implication sent a chill through Claire. What do you mean? Come inside, Margaret repeated. What I'm about to tell you could change everything, including who ultimately faces justice for Eliza's death. Margaret's cottage was warm, scented with wood smoke from a small fire crackling in the grate. The older woman moved with deliberate slowness, a frailty evident in her movements that hadn't been present the previous night. Whether this was genuine or calculated for Claire's benefit remained unclear. Sit, Margaret instructed, gesturing to an armchair near the fire. You look exhausted. Claire took the offered seat, watching as Margaret poured them both small glasses of amber liquid. I've had enough cryptic warnings and partial truths, Claire said firmly. Whatever you know, I want it plainly stated. Margaret handed Claire a glass, then settled into her own chair with a slight grimace of discomfort. Very well, plain truth. Sean was there the night Eliza died. The statement hung in the air between them, devastating in its simplicity. Claire struggled to maintain her composure. That's impossible. Sean was sent to Dublin by his father. The next morning, yes, Margaret confirmed, after everything had happened. But that night, Sean came to Blackwater House with Daniel. I know, because I drove them both there. Claire's glass trembled in her hand. Why would you drive them? Daniel had been drinking heavily after his confrontation with Richard Callahan at the golf club. He wasn't in a state to drive himself, and he insisted on confronting Eliza about the letters she'd found. Margaret sipped her drink, her gaze distant with memory. I tried to talk him out of it, told him to wait until morning when he was sober. But Daniel Murphy was not a man easily dissuaded once his mind was set. And Sean? Why was he there? He came to protect Eliza? Margaret said, surprising Claire. He'd overheard his father's ranting about the Callahan girl who was threatening to destroy everything. Sean insisted on accompanying Daniel, believing he could mediate, prevent his father from frightening Eliza. Claire tried to reconcile this with what Sean had told her, that he'd gone to the willow tree for their planned meeting, waited for Eliza, who never appeared. This contradicts everything Sean has said. I imagine it does, Margaret agreed. The truth rarely aligns with the stories we tell ourselves to live with our actions. What happened at Blackwater that night? Claire asked, dreading the answer. Margaret set down her glass, folding her hands in her lap. I remained in the car, parked near the servants' entrance. Daniel and Sean entered through the kitchen. The staff had been given the night off to prepare for the family's departure, so the house was empty except for Eliza, who was packing for her planned escape with Sean. I heard shouting from an upstairs room, Daniel's voice, primarily, but also Eliza's and occasionally Sean's. After perhaps 20 minutes, Daniel emerged alone, visibly agitated. He ordered me to drive to a groundskeeper's shed on the property, where he retrieved a shovel and some tools. Claire felt sick, imagining the scene. Where was Sean during this? Still in the house with Eliza, according to Daniel. He said they were sorting things out while he prepared for what needed to happen next. He was planning to kill her, Claire whispered, horrified. Margaret shook her head slowly. I don't believe that was his original intention. I think he wanted to frighten her, to recover the letters, to ensure her silence about his criminal activities. But something went badly wrong inside that house. What? I don't know exactly, Margaret admitted. I never went inside, but when Sean finally emerged, nearly an hour later, he was alone. His clothes were disheveled and there was blood on his hands. Claire stood abruptly, unable to remain seated with this revelation pulsing through her. You're saying Sean killed Eliza? Not Daniel? I'm saying I don't know who struck the fatal blow, Margaret clarified. But Sean was present when Eliza died. He helped his father construct the box they buried her in. He helped carry her body to the ice house. These are facts I witnessed with my own eyes, Claire, not speculation. Why? Claire demanded, her voice breaking. Why would Sean hurt the woman he loved, the mother of his unborn child? Perhaps he didn't mean to, Margaret suggested, her tone softening. Perhaps it was an accident during an argument. Or perhaps Daniel struck her in anger, and Sean helped cover it up to protect his father. I wasn't in that room. I can only tell you what I saw afterward. Claire paced the small room, trying to process this devastating information. If what you're saying is true, why didn't you tell the police? Why tell me instead? I told them Sean was present at Blackwater that night, Margaret corrected. I didn't specify what role he played, because I genuinely don't know. I've carried enough guilt for my part in this tragedy. I won't condemn a man without certainty of his actions. Then why tell me these details? What do you expect me to do with this information? Margaret rose slowly, moving to a small desk in the corner. From a drawer, she withdrew an old flip phone. Because of this, Daniel gave it to me for safekeeping the day after Eliza died. He said it contained evidence that might be needed someday if questions arose about what happened. Claire stared at the outdated device. What's on it? I don't know. It's password protected, and Daniel never shared the code with me. But he was explicit that it should never be destroyed, despite the risk it potentially posed to him. Margaret held out the phone. Perhaps Sean knows the password? Brilliant, perhaps he doesn't. But whatever it contains might reveal the full truth of that night. Claire hesitated before taking the phone. Why give this to me instead of the police? Because you deserve the choice, Margaret said simply. The choice to learn the truth privately first, to decide how to proceed based on what you discover. Sean is your husband, whatever his past actions may have been. Before Claire could respond, her own phone chimed with an incoming text. It was from Sean. Released from station. Coming home now. Where are you? Claire looked up at Margaret, decision crystallizing. I need to go. Sean's on his way home. Of course, Margaret said, walking Claire to the door. Whatever you decide to do with that phone, remember this. The truth about that night isn't as simple as who struck the fatal blow. It's about the choices everyone made afterward. The years of deception, the collaborative effort to bury not just Eliza's body, but the truth of who she was and what she had discovered. At the door, Margaret added, one last thing. The developer's planning to build on Blackwater's grounds? The company is owned by a consortium that includes Sean's medical practice as a major investor. He purchased those shares 3 months ago, immediately after his father's death. Claire stared at Margaret, the implication clear. You think he invested to have control over what happens at Blackwater? To ensure any excavation was carefully managed? I think, Margaret said carefully, that coincidences are rare in matters of this magnitude. Sean returned to Newcastle with a clear purpose after his father died. Whether that purpose was exposing the truth or controlling its revelation remains for you to determine. As Claire walked back to her own house in the gathering darkness, Daniel Murphy's old phone felt impossibly heavy in her pocket. Whatever it contained, evidence of Sean's guilt, proof of his innocence, or something in between, would irrevocably change her understanding of the man she had married. The house lights were still off when she arrived home, indicating Sean hadn't yet returned from the police station. Claire moved through the darkened rooms, eventually settling in their bedroom where the view of Blackwater House, now illuminated by police floodlights as the investigation continued through the night, dominated the window. She placed the old phone on the bedside table and sat watching it, as if it might suddenly reveal its secrets without prompting. What password would Daniel Murphy have used for a device containing evidence about Eliza's death? A date? A name? Some combination of numbers significant to him? Claire heard the front door open downstairs, followed by Sean's footsteps moving through the house. Claire? He called. Are you home? Upstairs, she responded, not moving from her position by the window. Sean appeared in the doorway moments later, exhaustion evident in the slump of his shoulders and the shadows beneath his eyes. God, what a day, he sighed, loosening his tie. The police questioned me for hours about my relationship with Eliza, my whereabouts the night she disappeared, my father's activities. I feel like I've been through a ringer. Claire studied her husband carefully, searching for signs of deception, of guilt. What did you tell them? The truth, Sean replied, moving to sit on the edge of the bed. That I arranged to meet Eliza at the willow tree, but she never showed up. That my father sent me to Dublin the next morning, claiming the Callahans had already left for America. That I had no direct knowledge of what happened to her until we discovered her remains today. Each statement contradicted Margaret's account of that night. Claire felt her heart constrict with the growing certainty that her husband, the man she loved, had built a life with, was lying directly to her face. Sean, she said quietly, someone saw you at Blackwater House that night, with your father, with Eliza. He froze, his expression shifting from exhaustion to wariness. Who told you that? Margaret Byrne, Claire admitted. She says she drove you both there, that you entered the house while she waited outside. That you emerged later with blood on your hands. Sean stared at her, his face pale in the dim light from the window. For a long moment, silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken truths and accumulated lies. She's manipulating you, he said finally. Margaret has always had her own agenda. She's trying to protect herself by shifting blame. Is she lying? Claire pressed. Were you not at Blackwater House with your father that night? Sean stood, moving to the window to stare out at the illuminated estate below. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible. I was there. The simple admission struck Claire like a physical blow. Why lie about it? All this time, why maintain you went to the willow tree and waited for her? Because the truth is so much worse, Sean replied, not turning to face her. Because I couldn't bear for you to know what really happened that night. Did you kill her? Claire forced herself to ask the unthinkable question. Did you hurt Eliza? Sean turned then, anguish etched in his features. No, God, no. I loved her. He moved back to the bed, sitting heavily. But I didn't stop it from happening either. I was there, and I did nothing when I could have saved her. Tell me what happened, Claire demanded. All of it, Sean. No more lies. Sean closed his eyes briefly, as if gathering courage. My father discovered Eliza had found the letters between our great-grandfathers. He was enraged, not just about the family history they revealed, but because she'd also stumbled across documents connecting him to paramilitary funding. He was drunk, ranting about how she would destroy everything he'd built. I overheard him planning to confront her that night, while her parents were attending a farewell dinner in the village. I insisted on going too, believing I could mediate, protect Eliza from his anger. Sean's voice grew distant, lost in the painful memory. Margaret drove us to Blackwater. I found Eliza in her bedroom, packing for our planned departure. She was surprised to see me early, confused about why my father was there. Daniel demanded the letters, threatened her when she wouldn't reveal where she'd hidden them. The argument escalated. I tried to calm them both, to create some compromise. But my father... Sean's voice broke. He struck her when she refused to cooperate. Not hard, just a slap, but she fell awkwardly against the bedpost. There was blood. Claire watched her husband reliving the moment, his hands trembling slightly. She was unconscious but breathing. I wanted to call an ambulance immediately, but my father refused, said it would ruin both families if it became public that he'd assaulted Richard Callahan's daughter. While we argued about what to do, Eliza stopped breathing. I tried to revive her, everything my medical training had taught me, but she was gone. A simple head injury, probably treatable if we'd sought help immediately. Sean's shoulders slumped with the weight of his failure. My father said it was too late for an ambulance, that no one would believe it was an accident, given the history between our families, his business dealings, the timing with the Callahan's departure. So you helped him hide her body, Claire concluded, horror and pity warring within her. Yes, Sean admitted, his voice hollow. I helped him build a crate from materials in the groundskeeper's shed, helped him carry her to the ice house, helped him bury her there. He looked up, eyes swimming with 15 years of accumulated guilt. And then I let him send me to Dublin. Let myself believe his fiction that she'd changed her mind, gone with her parents to America. Because the alternative, accepting what I'd participated in, was unbearable. Claire struggled to process this confession. Not a cold-blooded murderer then, but a young man who had made catastrophic choices in a moment of crisis, who had prioritized family loyalty and self-protection over justice for the woman he claimed to love. Why come back now? She asked. After 15 years, why return to the scene of what happened? When my father died, I found documents in his papers, references to payments made to Richard Callahan, notes about maintaining the fiction of Eliza's new life in America. It confirmed what I'd begun to suspect over the years but had pushed away. Sean ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of profound distress. I realized both our fathers had conspired to hide what happened, that they'd built an elaborate fiction spanning continents. So you came back to Newcastle? To find the truth, Sean insisted. To confirm what I suspected, to find Eliza's remains and ensure she received proper burial. To make some small amends for my failure that night. And the development company? Claire challenged. The one planning to build on Blackwater, in which your medical practice conveniently invested 3 months ago? Surprise flashed across Sean's features. How did you? Margaret told me. She seems to know everything about your business dealings. Sean sighed heavily. Yes, I invested in the development, not to control the excavation as you're clearly thinking, but to ensure I had input into how the property was handled, to guide them away from the ice house if possible, or to prepare them if remains were discovered there. More manipulation, Claire said bitterly. More controlling the narrative instead of simply telling the truth. I was trying to do the right thing, Sean insisted, in my own flawed way. The right thing would have been going to the police 15 years ago, Claire countered. The right thing would have been telling me all of this before you brought me to live overlooking the site of your most terrible failure. Sean had no defense for this, his silence an admission of the justice in her accusation. They sat together in the half-dark room, the floodlights from Blackwater House casting strange shadows across the walls. There's something else, Claire said finally, reaching for Daniel's phone on the bedside table. Margaret gave me this. She says your father left it with her for safekeeping, that it contains evidence about what happened that night. Sean stared at the phone as if it might burn him. I remember that phone. My father used it only for certain sensitive communications, kept it separate from his regular device. Do you know the password? Sean hesitated, then nodded slowly. Probably. He used variations of the same code for everything secure. Claire held out the phone. Open it. Let's see what evidence your father thought important enough to preserve, but too dangerous to keep himself. With visible reluctance, Sean took the phone, powering it on, the screen illuminated with a password prompt. He entered a 6-digit number, and the phone unlocked immediately. My mother's birth date, he explained quietly, in reverse. Together, they examined the phone's contents. There were no calls logged, no text messages saved. Only the photo gallery contained files, a series of images from what appeared to be security camera footage. Blackwater had cameras? Claire asked, surprised. Not officially, Sean replied, his expression darkening as he scrolled through the images. My father must have installed them secretly before confronting Eliza, to have leverage over Richard if needed. The photos showed several angles of Blackwater's entrance hall and main staircase. In them, Daniel Murphy could be seen arguing with Eliza near the bottom of the stairs. Sean appeared in later images, attempting to separate them. The final photos showed Eliza falling, her head striking the ornate newel post at the base of the staircase. He documented it, Claire whispered, horrified by the calculated nature of this evidence. He was planning to use these to protect himself. Insurance, Sean agreed grimly. Proof that her death was accidental, not murder. Proof he could have used against Richard Callahan if the agreement between them ever fell apart. Claire took the phone back, continuing to scroll through the images. There were more. Photos of the makeshift coffin being constructed, of Eliza's body being placed inside, of Sean and Daniel carrying it across the grounds toward the ice house. My God, she breathed. He documented everything. The entire cover-up. The final image made her gasp aloud. It showed Sean standing alone by the freshly covered grave inside the ice house, his expression a mask of grief and shock. In his hand was a small object that glinted in the flashlight's beam. A ring. Eliza's engagement ring, Sean confirmed, his voice breaking. I kept it. For 15 years, I kept it hidden in my medical bag, a reminder of what happened, of what I failed to prevent. Claire set the phone down, the weight of everything she'd learned in the past 2 days settling over her like a shroud. Her husband had not killed Eliza, but he had helped hide her death. Had participated in a deception that spanned 15 years and 2 continents. Had returned to Newcastle not just for truth and justice, but for some measure of personal redemption. What will you do now? Sean asked quietly, the question containing layers of meaning. What would she do with this evidence? With their marriage, with the life they had built together on a foundation of secrets. Claire looked out the window toward Blackwater House, where police continued their methodical examination of Eliza's makeshift grave. In the morning, she would need to make decisions about the phone, about Sean, about their future together, if there was to be one. But in this moment, suspended between revelation and decision, Claire simply sat with the understanding that the man beside her was both the husband she had loved and a stranger whose darkest moments she was only beginning to comprehend. The perfect beginning she had imagined for their life in Newcastle had been an illusion, but perhaps, through the painful excavation of long-buried truths, they might find their way to something more authentic, built on honesty rather than carefully constructed facades. I don't know yet. She answered finally, her voice steady despite the uncertainty ahead. But whatever happens next, it will be based on truth. All of it, Sean. No more secrets beneath the surface. 6 months later, Claire stood at the edge of Mourne Heights Cemetery, watching as mourners dispersed from Eliza Callahan's long-delayed funeral. The investigation had concluded weeks earlier, with Daniel Murphy posthumously identified as responsible for her death, albeit ruled accidental rather than intentional homicide. Sean had been charged with being an accessory after the fact and perverting the course of justice, resulting in a suspended sentence and community service, his medical career preserved, though permanently marked by the scandal. Richard Callahan, extradited from Boston, faced more serious charges for his role in concealing his daughter's death and accepting payments to maintain the fiction of her new life. The Callahan-Murphy feud, spanning generations, built on a foundation of lies, had finally ended with the public revelation of Thomas Callahan and Philip Murphy's true relationship. The letters Eliza had discovered, eventually located in a safe deposit box Margaret had maintained for years, were donated to the Northern Ireland Historical Society, documenting a love story hidden beneath decades of manufactured animosity. As the cemetery emptied, Claire remained by a nearby oak tree, watching James Callahan place a final bouquet on his niece's grave. He had been tireless in ensuring Eliza received justice, insisting on a proper burial and memorial despite his brother's objections. The pregnancy had been acknowledged in the service. The unborn child mourned alongside its mother. Mrs. Murphy. Claire turned to find Detective Inspector Walsh approaching, case files tucked under her arm. The investigation had transformed them from interrogator and suspect into something approaching colleagues, bound by their mutual determination to uncover the truth. "Inspector," Claire acknowledged. "I thought the case was officially closed." "It is," Walsh confirmed. "I just wanted to return these to you personally." She handed Claire a small envelope containing Eliza's letters to Sean, the correspondence that had begun Claire's journey into the past. "No longer needed as evidence. Thank you." Claire accepted the envelope, its contents now feeling more like historical artifacts than personal revelations. "What will happen to Margaret Byrne?" Walsh's expression remained professional. "Ms. Byrne has been charged with being an accessory after the fact. Given her terminal diagnosis, the Crown Prosecution Service has agreed to home confinement rather than incarceration." Claire nodded, unsurprised. Margaret had ultimately cooperated fully with the investigation, providing testimony that corroborated Sean's account while detailing her own role in maintaining the deception over 15 years. "And Blackwater House?" Claire asked. "The development?" "Postponed indefinitely," Walsh replied. "The publicity surrounding the case has made the property rather unmarketable. The county is considering alternatives, perhaps a historical preservation site." They stood in silence for a moment, watching James place a hand on Eliza's headstone in a final farewell before walking slowly toward the cemetery gates. "Your husband didn't attend the service," Walsh observed neutrally. "No," Claire confirmed. "He thought his presence would be unwelcome, disrespectful to the family's grief." "And yet you came." "I needed to," Claire said simply, "to witness Eliza finally receiving the dignity she was denied for so long. To see something resembling justice, however imperfect." Walsh studied her with those penetrating eyes. "You've remained in Newcastle, in the same house." It wasn't a question, but Claire answered anyway. "Yes, running away would solve nothing. The house is just a house, it's what we build within it that matters." "And your marriage?" Claire looked toward the exit where Sean waited by their car, respecting her need to attend the service alone while remaining supportive from a distance. "We're rebuilding. Slowly, honestly. With a foundation of truth this time, painful as it sometimes is." Walsh nodded, seeming to understand. "Relationships built on secrets rarely survive their exposure. Those that do are often stronger for having weathered the storm." "We'll see," Claire said, unwilling to make predictions about a future still taking shape. "But we're trying. That's all anyone can do after something like this. Acknowledge the past honestly and try to build something better going forward." As Claire walked toward Sean, she glanced back once at Eliza's grave. A young woman whose life had been cut short by a moment of violence, whose death had been hidden by powerful men protecting their reputations, whose truth had finally emerged after 15 years beneath the surface. The secrets of Mourne Heights had been exposed, The perfect facades of its wealthy residents cracked to reveal the flawed humanity beneath. And in that exposure, Claire had discovered that the most valuable foundation for any new beginning wasn't perfection, but truth. However difficult, however painful, however transformative its revelation might be. Sean opened the car door as she approached, his face a question she answered with a small nod. Together they drove away from the cemetery toward their home on the hill. The shadow of Blackwater House, no longer a silent accusation, but a reminder of the cost of secrets and the power of truth to finally set them free. The end.